fighting, a huge city was divided into two very different parts. One side was filled with slums, where the poor struggled to survive, while the other was dominated by towering buildings where the elite lived in luxury. As Sunny walked through the streets of the elite district, he noticed that everyone was wearing masks. Even while chatting with one another, they kept their faces covered, as though they were afraid of catching some kind of disease. Sunny sat on a street bench, holding a cup of coffee in his hand. He had always dreamed of tasting something like this while living in the slums. Since he had spent nearly all the money he had left on it, it had better be worth the price. He took a sip. The moment the coffee touched his tongue, he immediately spat it onto the ground. Damn, this is way too bitter. What a rip-off. Sunny stared at the cup with disappointment. I should have just bought some real meat instead. He sighed before taking another sip. Well, at least it'll wake me up. With that, Sunny quickly finished his coffee and placed the empty cup beside him. He then tossed it towards a nearby dustbin, but he missed. The cup fell onto the ground. Sunny stood on the bench, bent down, and picked it up. This time, he calmly tossed it into the dustbin and made sure it landed inside. There we go. He then continued walking. Suddenly, Sunny slapped himself across the face. I'm still sleepy. The nearby people wearing masks stared at him in confusion. Sunny continued staggering down the street, his eyes still heavy with sleep. Just make it to the police station, he muttered. As he walked, he continued smacking himself in the face, desperately trying to wake himself up. I just have to hold on. The people nearby continued staring at him, clearly bewildered by his strange behavior. Sunny, however, paid them no attention and simply trudged onward, determined to reach the police station. A few minutes later, Sunny arrived at the police station. Inside, the officers were busy carrying out their daily duties. Everything seemed perfectly normal until one of the officers noticed Sunny standing near the entrance. The officer immediately approached him. Hey, kid, are you lost or something? Sunny was still shivering, his body trembling from the cold. He took a deep breath before speaking. In accordance with Special Directive No. 3, I'm turning myself in as a carrier of the nightmare spell. The officer froze, his eyes widened in shock and disbelief. He slammed both hands onto the desk in front of him. What? He immediately reached for the station's communication system and shouted into the speaker. Attention, NQSC Precinct 7, Code Black in progress. I repeat, Code Black. Sunny was infected with the nightmare spell. The nightmare spell had first appeared decades ago. At first, it seemed like nothing more than an illness that caused chronic fatigue and drowsiness. However, when its victims began falling into an endless slumber, the world finally took notice. Eventually, this phenomenon became known as the nightmare spell, but it was no ordinary disease. The spell was a form of magic, or perhaps a curse. Those who died in their sleep would transform into terrifying monsters known as nightmare creatures. These creatures began hunting humans indiscriminately, and even the military's heavy firepower proved useless against them. Before long, the world was swallowed by despair and chaos. And then, something unexpected happened. People who had fallen asleep began to awaken. They were the infected who had succumbed to the nightmare spell, but they were also the awakened, the survivors who had overcome the deadly trials within their nightmares. By surviving those trials, they gained miraculous powers. With these newfound abilities, they pushed back the nightmare creatures and gradually restored a semblance of peace to the world. Over time, the awakened became humanity's hope. They established themselves as guardians, protecting ordinary people from the nightmare creatures and creating an entirely new world order. To prepare for the possibility that students might become infected, schools began teaching skills necessary for survival and combat. The wealthy even paid enormous sums of money so that their children could receive specialized training to become awakened. Furthermore, children born into powerful awakened families could inherit extraordinary magical abilities, such as memories and echoes. But none of that had anything to do with a slum rat like me. For someone like me, being chosen by the nightmare spell wasn't an opportunity. It was nothing more than a death sentence. The police officers escorted Sunny to the Northern Quadrant Siege Capital, Precinct 7.
What's your name?
Sunless, he muttered. But people call me Sunny. Sunless. The officer raised an eyebrow. That's an unusual name. Sunny forced his eyes open and gave a tired smile. I was born during a solar eclipse. My mom had a poetic soul, you see. The officer paused before continuing. Do you want us to contact your family? There's no one to contact, Sunny replied. I'm fine. All right. The officer glanced at his notes. Then, Sunless, how much longer can you stay awake? Sunny struggled to keep his eyes open. Not much longer. The officer's expression became serious. Then we'll skip the formalities. Listen carefully and try to hang on. He leaned forward. How much do you really know about the nightmare spell? Sunny answered sleepily. Just go into the dream realm, kill a few monsters, complete the first nightmare, then get magic powers and become an awakened, right? The officer nodded. So you know the basics, at least. But listen carefully. Inside the first nightmare, you'll encounter not only monsters, but people as well. Sunny looked at him with curiosity. People? They aren't real. They are merely illusions created to test you. Sunny frowned. How do you know that? The officer's expression remained grim. You might have to kill them. So, for your own sake, think of them as nothing more than illusions. He continued explaining. The moment you enter the nightmare, check your attributes and aspect. If you receive a combat-oriented aspect, such as a swordsman or an archer, things will be much easier for you. But even if you receive an aspect unrelated to combat, don't despair. There are no truly useless aspects. After all, the spell sets up trials, not executions. The officer paused, making sure Sunny was still listening. So, do everything in your power to survive. What you do during the trial will determine the rewards and powers waiting for you if you succeed. Sunny's eyelids began to droop. But if you die, the officer continued, you become a gate through which a monster can appear in the real world. Sunny's eyes slowly blinked. It was becoming increasingly difficult for him to keep them open. The officer continued, if that happens, my colleagues and I will have to deal with it. So please don't die, Sunless. He sighed. Or at least, don't die right away. It'll take a few hours for the nearest awakened to arrive. We'd really appreciate it if you didn't make us fight that thing ourselves.